All right, this is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet, Chapter 29, Section 2, New Ways of Living in the Industrialized World. So really our focus in this particular chapter mostly is the post-World War I world. That is 1918 was when the war ended. And generally speaking, World War I changed a lot. This was a catalyst for change on a number of different fronts. And one thing that World War I changed was the significance of different kind of cultural and social division. So for example, things like class, nobility, gender, which is the role that men and women play, all of these things became less important. So when it came to something like identity, noble birth or, an aristocratic bloodline, or the difference between the aristocrats and the commoners, like I mentioned before, became less important. Instead, many nations moved towards a more standardized way of identifying people, which included various documentation, which, was a combination of documentation plus photography, right? A picture of someone, maybe a description if photography wasn't available yet. The technology was certainly developing in the post-World War I era. But this was included to, but not limited to, things like passports for international travel. So a passport is required for international travel. This, of course, was brought with the advent of the airplane, which, of course, is a new technology which was in World War I, but really didn't become commercial until after the war. Driver's license, of course, this became standard identity when automobiles became much more popular, or various health systems. We might think of this as like welfare programs, and typically welfare programs required citizens to have some sort of identifying feature so that they could receive benefits from the state or receive benefits from the government. In the United States, this took on the form of Social Security cards. Social Security was essentially a pension for, or a retirement plan for the elderly in the United States. This came about, I believe, in 1935, I want to say, was when Social Security came in. So again, all of these things being relatively new, post-World War I technologies, in the case of automobiles and airplanes, at least becoming more popular, or even health systems or welfare programs. A lot of countries moved towards more sophisticated welfare programs post-World War I because the government had already been doing so much during the war that simply extending those benefits from soldiers to civilians was kind of a natural progression, you might say, and many states did that. Other technologies were developed, such as fingerprints, which could also be used to be an identifier. The idea that everybody's fingerprint is unique, or that you could identify one using that. So that became more common as well. But a lot of these things were based, kind of less off of, ideas of class and nobility, and much more in terms of sort of a standardized form. One thing that changed pretty significantly were the lives of women, especially in those nations that participated very heavily in the war. Recall that World War I led to more opportunities for women. In terms of jobs, this led to women occupying what we'd call stereotypically male professions. So we might say male professions. Of course, what was considered to be, we'll put it in quotes, what was considered to be male professions, increasingly occupied by women. Now, it is true that after World War I was over, when many of the soldiers returned home from the battle or from the war itself, that a lot of women did lose their jobs, but a lot of women also kept their jobs. The war also helped erode various gender distinctions. ideas about what it was supposed to be like to be male and what it was supposed to be like to be female, those things were fundamentally challenged by the war. And this was reflected in culture, in women adopting sort of new cultural norms. This could be, this could include things like, drinking alcohol, smoking, driving. All these things were culturally male behaviors. And after the war was over, more women were engaged in this. Sometimes we use this term, the new woman, to describe some of the kind of what we might say the new definition of feminine. We got to recall that we're moving from the Victorian era, where things were very much rigid and strict in terms of the way that how men and women should behave and act, to this idea of the new woman, which was characterized in various behaviors. It was also in style, dress, the types of clothes one wore, actions, etc., etc. On the political front, World War I was a major catalyst for suffrage, and suffrage is the right to vote. So we've got some countries listed here and the years in which women were granted suffrage or the right to vote. Russia in 1917, that was part of the Russian Revolution. Germany 1918, Britain 1918, United States 1920, and Turkey 1934. A lot of this was due in part to women's contributions in the war. Recall that we described World War I as a total war. And a total war was a war in which every single member of the population needed to be mobilized in order to, fight the war effort. This included men, women, and children. So women having participated in World War I, having occupied roles and jobs that were historically denied to them, assisting and aiding in their country's war effort, whether that was victory or defeat, ultimately culminated in many areas the right to vote, and that was to gain a presence in the formal political process. Women, even before the war, had been actively involved in social reform movements. Social, again, when you see that word, think about society. These are generally reform movements to try to make society better. This continued even after World War I. Some examples of reformers include Jane Addams. She was an American, so we'll say in the US, and she used what were called settlement houses. And settlement houses were institutions designed to help the poor, especially in urban areas. So we'll say help urban poor. Especially in the United States, many immigrants coming to the US with really not a lot of wealth or really knowledge about the country, they could go to these settlement houses, which Jane Addams was in and assist to try to help them with job education or finding a house or anything like that. Margaret Sanger was probably the most controversial social reformer. She advocated for birth control. Oftentimes she was pursued by the authorities under the accusation that she was spreading pornography rather than birth control, but she was a vocal supporter of spreading information and education about birth control, particularly for women. So along with changes to class and nobility, along to the changes that went with women, there was also a significant change in the sciences or in the knowledge department. Now, this maybe had a little bit less to do with World War I in particular, but was certainly associated with it. So new understandings about what the world is and how it functions. Max Planck discovered atoms. Atoms, of course, if you're not familiar with the scientific term, it's kind of like the building block of matter, right? Matter is just material. It's also the smallest. I think that's actually where the word atom comes from, like the Greek term for like the smallest, I don't know what you would call it. I guess you would just call it an atom. This discovery was, again, something that kind of transformed the way that people understand the world around them, the fundamental building blocks of everything around us. Albert Einstein might be the most important scientist. His theory of relativity shattered really understandings about physics and gravity. The theory of relativity, again, relates to gravity. Recall that during the scientific revolution, Isaac Newton, right, so this is like way back in like the 1600s, I believe Newton was about, maybe 1700s. Isaac Newton came up with the idea of universal laws, right, of which, gravity was a part of it. And that was to state that, no matter where you were, when you were, if you threw something up in the air, then it would always come back down, right? What goes up must come down. And these laws never changed, right? They were universal and they applied everywhere, and they were the same. Albert Einstein comes along and just completely shatters that and says, look, gravity really depends on where you are, right? And this, again, these two fundamental, ideas of everything being relative, again, that being like perspective, and things being universal, again, it's this idea of universality that is getting shattered. So, for example, something, I don't know if Einstein actually talked about this in particular, but something that might help make this theory of relativity make more sense is that, well, if you're on another planet, then the force of gravity is actually different, right? And that's what Einstein would say in terms of relativity. Gravity is the same here on Earth, right? Maybe it's universal on Earth, but even the force of gravity is different depending on how far down to the Earth's core that you get. And this is especially true if you go on other planets, right? And again, this idea of relativity fundamentally changed the sciences, and it would, kind of reflect in not just sciences, but really everything, just the understanding about, things. Sigmund Freud, also a very important contributor. We might say that, these changes here were more associated with the social sciences. Sigmund Freud was especially concerned with the unconscious. Actually, I have no idea how to spell conscious. Let me check here real quick. S-C-I-O-U-S. Let's see, C-O-N-S-C. So it looks like I just missed an S. Not too bad. He was concerned with the unconscious. He was concerned with psychology. And more or less, Sigmund Freud's contribution was that, people really aren't the intellectual, rational beings that they presume to be, right? So here, on the other hand, you have rationality, you have, logic. And, to add this to what Newton discovered, these things, these ideas about human beings having universality and, emphasizing things like rationality and logic, these things were hallmarks of the Enlightenment, which were characterized by events like the American Revolution and the French Revolution. If Freud comes along and says, look, this idea that people are rational and logic and that people are quote unquote civilized, this is all garbage. Instead, people really deep down are primitive and savage, and using psychoanalysis of dreams and stuff like that kind of reveals the primitive and savage nature of humankind. And this, of course, played very well with World War I, which revealed just exactly how barbaric even quote-unquote civilized Western Europe could be. There's nothing civilized about the First World War. And all these things really began to question the fundamental ideas grounded in Western civilization, which again were tied very heavily to the Enlightenment movement. You even saw this challenge take place in art. Modern art, again, kind of challenged the idea that art had to be realistic or rational. So we might say modern art challenged realistic and logical art. Probably the most famous modern artist was Pablo Picasso. who created artwork that was very much kind of nonsensical. We might call this abstract art. Igor Stravinsky, he was, I think, a playwright. Actually, no, not a play, composer. So again, this would be something like music. And in his production of Rites of Spring, it was, really, just to be frank about it, it was, it was awful sounding. Even when you look back to the Enlightenment and composers like Beethoven and Bach, music and musical notes sort of followed a sort of logical process. There was a certain method of creating or composing a certain musical number, right? And if you listen to Beethoven, it becomes very clear that certain notes put together in a certain way sound good. Well, Stravinsky said, forget that, right? Music doesn't need to be rational, doesn't need to be logical. It can be primitive. It can sound awful, but that doesn't mean that it's still art. And the same thing with the Dada movement, stressing things like emotion, also things maybe like spontaneous sort of ideas. Again, all this thing challenged the idea that art had to be realistic, and that's why you get sort of very bizarre abstractions in this here. But fundamentally, this was tied to challenging, kind of the fundamental notions of what Western civilization was and everything that went into that. Because again, World War I showed that maybe Western civilization wasn't all that it was, supposed to be. New technologies continued to change the way that people lived. Aircraft or airplanes. This is a German airplane you see right here. Orville and Wilbur Wright, or Wilbur and Orville Wright. These were U.S. inventors of the airplane. They did have some experience in the war, but after the war, they became more commercial. So people could use the airplane to fly to various different destinations. KLM, Royal Dutch Airlines. This is the longest continuous airlines in the world. I believe that they began making commercial flights. That commercial means, to the public. So not like military flights, but like, being able to go from one place to the other. I believe they started around the 1920s and are still today. And this also, these airplanes and various airliners, this was world travel. You could fly from, Australia to Asia to Europe. And this allowed for people to break free from, rail lines, for example. Other medical technologies, X-rays invented by Marie Curie. We'll say she is the inventor of the X-ray. In general, X-rays, if you're not familiar, allow for doctors to see people's skeletons. This was a way to better treat injury. And of course, the catalyst for this was World War I, soldiers with broken bones, or all sorts of different things that were problems. And consciousness about disease and infection was certainly raised around the world. Your textbook describes this cult of cleanliness, which we might say is an obsession with, germs maybe. And this was passed on to people's households. And this led to way better standards of living, right? Improved health. Things like soap becoming more available, but being advertised in this post-World War I era. And especially in some of the industrial worlds that had access to consumer goods like soap, this cult of cleanliness really did improve health in a rather dramatic way. Another change in some of the ways that people spent their pastime was the rise of spectator sports. This includes, but is not limited to, things like baseball, soccer or football, American football, boxing. A good example of this is the revival of the Olympic Games. So 1896, the Olympic Games were an ancient Greek tradition They were revived by Baron Pierre de Coubertin. I don't know if I pronounced that right, but he is a French educator. And he revived the Olympic Games. And ever since 1896, every 4 years or so, save some sort of disaster like a war, every 4 years the Olympic Games are held and competing nations send their best athletes, and it becomes sort of a spectator, people tune in, right, to the Olympic Games. And this was in part due to some of the increase in pastime, especially in the post-World War I era. Lastly, the technology and the environment, two important things, again, in the post-World War I era. The first one being the skyscraper. Especially in places like the United States, there were actually laws in Europe that prevented buildings from going over a certain level, but that didn't apply to the US. The Empire State Building was some 80-some stories tall. It became the tallest building in the world in 1932. We can relate skyscrapers back to, let's see, I guess we didn't talk about it in this section, but if we went back to the last section, 29.1, we talked about urbanization. And one of the reasons as to why cities were able to grow so significantly in population was because buildings were built straight up, right, because of skyscrapers. So skyscrapers became much more prevalent in urban areas. So too did the change in architecture. And again, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, Corbusier. He really put forward kind of a simple, cheap, and efficient way to build buildings. And this really kind of ran counter to architects in the past who, really use buildings as kind of like a piece of art. The idea was, you build a building using the least amount of material necessary. You build them cheap, therefore you kind of get more bang to your buck. And a lot of modern architecture is based off of that principle. When it comes down to it, it's all about the dollars and cents. And, pretty much all modern buildings are kind of like that today. Another very important invention was or not really invention, but technology was the automobile. Automobiles had existed prior to World War I, but were pretty expensive until the assembly line. The assembly line is a method of mass production. And it made the automobile, or the car, we'll just call it the car, affordable. Henry Ford, of course, from the US, of Ford Automobiles, is the one who is credited with creating the assembly line. And we say that, Henry Ford didn't invent the car, but he democratized it. And what that means is that he made a production system with the assembly line that made it affordable. By the 1920s, by the late 1920s, the United States is the car ownership capital of the world. And one consequence that the automobile had was suburban sprawl, and that was for cities to spread really in every direction. So on the one hand, there are, massive skyscrapers that are going up that allow for cities to pack in a large number of people. But on the other hand, the ability for people to drive out into areas really all around the cities. Now, before, there was transportation, but recall it was things like, trains and subways. And so people were really limited in really where they could live in connection to their jobs and to their cities. The automobile pretty much makes it possible to go anywhere, anytime. And that allows for cities not just to, again, grow in terms of, skyscrapers and people being stacked on top of each other, but cities can really spread out as well. And that really contributes to a lot of the urbanization that we talked about in the last section.